Welcome to Detroit Today on 1019 WDET. I'm Stephen Henderson, and as always, thanks for tuning in. As you can hear, we have a live studio audience for this special edition of Detroit Today, where we are going to take a look closely at education in the city of Detroit. It's a topic we talk about a lot on this show. Normally, we just have conversations about schools. Tonight, we want to bring you a conversation with the schools, with the people who are most affected by education and education policy here in the city of Detroit. We have students, we have teachers, we have parents here in the studios at WDET prepared to ask questions of some of the decision makers about what is going on in Detroit Public Schools. Of course, now we have local control back in place in Detroit for the first time in nearly a decade. Alycia Meriweather is the superintendent. She is coming up on her 1-year anniversary in that role. She's the interim superintendent. Will she stay as the permanent superintendent? That's one of the questions that still lurks as we see the new governance of Detroit schools unfold. The key today, I think, is to really focus on the people who matter the most here. Students, parents, teachers, the people who every day are on the front lines of education and the decisions that get made in Lansing or in City Hall in Detroit. These are the people who have to navigate those choices. They have to cope with them and hopefully come out on the other end with that sufficient education, that adequate education that we so often talk about in our constitutional principles. We'll also be joined today by Alycia Meriweather. She's sitting here with me in the studio. We've also got Phil Pavlov, who is a Republican state senator, chair of the Senator Education Committee. He'll join us in a little bit. Also, Sherry Gay Danyogo, who's a Democratic state representative, former DPS teacher, is scheduled to join us as well. In this first segment, I'm also joined by Chastity Pratt-Dawsey. She is a reporter at Bridge Magazine, joins us frequently to talk about education on the show. Chastity, welcome to Detroit Today.
Hello, Detroit.
Absolutely. Also, Sasha Ryan, who is an education reporter here at WDET. Sasha, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much.
Yes. And so let's jump right into it with our first question. Rachel Burwell is a student at Osborne High School here in the city of Detroit. Rachel, come to the microphone and ask your question of our panel.
To me, equality doesn't mean that everyone gets the same thing. It means that we all get what we need. So I'm not here to ask, can we all get the same funds? I'm here to ask, can we get everything to keep the school open and afford supplies?
All right, Rachel, great question. Thank you very much for asking that. Alycia Meriweather, I'm going to let you start. You are the superintendent of the district. Talk about the equality question that we sometimes talk about at the state level. Here we have a student asking a very specific question about it.
It's a great question, Rachel. And which Osborne do you attend? Just
Evergreen.
Evergreen, Osborne Evergreen. So her question is really about equity versus equality. And so that vocabulary word is really critical because the difference between equity and equality is exactly what you just outlined. So equality means everyone gets the same thing no matter what. Equity means you get what you need, even if it's different than what someone else needs. And your point is a point that I fully support and believe in, and one of the things that Detroit Public Schools Community District is really fighting for in terms of what comes to Detroit Public Schools Community District to support teaching and learning in our schools. So I think this is a really important topic. I'm impressed that it's coming from a student. We have lawmakers and other people with many fancy degrees who seem not to understand this concept. But the truth of the matter is, in order for education to advance anywhere, but let's just talk about in Detroit and in the state of Michigan, we have to address this issue of inequity. And so when different schools and different students need different things, then those different things should be provided in order for us to meet the goals that we have. And if we don't close that gap, we will never, never, never achieve the goals that we've set for ourselves and for our students. So you brought up an excellent, excellent point. Thank you.
Chastity Pratt-Dawsey, you've covered the discussion about education at the state level for some time. We've had a statewide commission on this very question. a few years ago, they came out with a report that said what everybody I think already knew, which is that we don't fund schools adequately, or in terms of that equity question, in terms of who gets what, how much each school district gets. Where does that stand? Is there perhaps a move afoot to take that seriously and change the way we fund schools in Michigan, or is this a stalled proposal?
Well, the adequacy study that the legislature funded and that was completed a year or so ago, it had a lot of problems, so it didn't answer everybody's questions, and it came back saying basically if we did adequately fund schools, scores would only go up a smidge. So everybody kind of like frowned at that, the findings of the adequacy study. But one thing that I am hearing out of Lansing is there's growing discussion about rejiggering Proposal A, which is the statewide school funding formula. And part of the reason people are really starting to buy into it is because cities are suffering and would like some different ways to increase property taxes for their own budgets. So right now there is some real discussion about rejiggering Proposal A as far as I'm hearing. Now, that could take years still, but the conversation is starting to be had, not only because schools are suffering, not only because schools are not equitably funded, but because now municipalities are looking for a way to rejigger property taxes so that the municipalities aren't suffering as much. So I think you're going to hear some more about this going towards spring.
Yeah. Let's go to our next question from Yakuza. Yakuza, you have a question about decriminalizing our classrooms. What do you mean by that?
Yes, peace, Steve. I am a big fan of Detroit Today. I listen a lot.
There you go.
But
Great.
I love WDT. But yeah, my question was, how do we begin to decriminalize the classroom? There's a definite tension. Looking back on my time in DPS and some of my peers in time in DPS, there's a definite tension between teachers, school, and staff. As far as with anything from metal detectors to drug dogs and things like that, there's an attitude, a tension. There's a conflict between us. Like everybody is at risk. Everybody is I don't know, halfway out of the door. It doesn't seem like there's a real equal opportunity phase for everybody to learn on an equal level. From the time that I was in DPS, it was a very strict thing. It was a lot of conflict. It was a lot of just heavy lifting with everybody in the space. Like you had to really hold your own just to be in a classroom at times, and from my own personal experience. So my question would be, how do we begin to decriminalize that and see each other as equals on a school level?
Alycia Meriweather, talk about the extent to which there is a pipeline between our schools and the criminal justice system, something we also hear about at the national level quite a bit. Here we hear a young man right here in the city who says he's witnessed it firsthand.
Yakuza, I really appreciate that question. I taught middle school for about 12 years, and what you're describing is what I saw in some classrooms, and then in other classrooms I saw an element of respect and rapport and relationship that created an atmosphere that encouraged learning and mutual respect, and created a space where people could explore questions, answer questions, and have an opportunity to really dig deeply into topics in a realm of respect. So I don't know if you've experienced that too, that there were classrooms where there was respect, and there were classrooms where it felt that there was just this tension. And it's something I've seen in the roles as an administrator, going in and out of pretty much 97 buildings, 97 schools we have. You can see everything across the whole gamut. You mentioned metal detectors, and you mentioned other things that happen, but we also have schools that don't rely on metal detectors to maintain order, right? So you have some schools that have school culture that is so strong around respect and building up how we treat one another, as opposed to threats or the disciplinarian piece of keeping order. I think when you look at how students are treated, and then also how adults in the building are treated and how we interact with one another, that's where you peel back the layers of your question. So there's some key things, and I'd be curious what the other panelists think, but one thing I've observed is when fear exists, respect is very difficult to come by. And so to me, one of the first pieces is to pull back fear. I loved my students, and I love every student when I'm in and out of schools. And I'll tell you, I come across students every day who I'd never met before I saw them. They come up and give me a hug. And there's this piece that comes when you're working with young people and they know that you love them and they know that you respect them, but they also know there's an appropriate way to behave and interact for myself as an adult and for a student, right? So it's a mutual respect that needs to exist. And I think this piece around decriminalization of the school system is one that really needs to be explored, because the prison pipeline that people talk about has to be broken down in the school system. Otherwise, we are feeding into a criminal system, and that's not what the educational system was set up for. That is not why education exists. So promoting respect, mutual respect, rapport, relationship, that's when you see positive movement in schools. And really thinking about how are we dealing with discipline, how are we dealing with culture and climate in schools. And what I always say, because I've had lots of people say to me, I wish we still had corporal punishment. You'd be surprised how many people talk about we should still have corporal punishment, and if we were allowed to spank children, we wouldn't have all of these issues. I always say this, and I've got some people in the audience nodding, but listen, I never had to touch a single student, but I could make a student cry in the sense that they felt badly about what had happened because there was a violation of trust. You don't have to touch someone, and you don't have to have all these disciplinary things to have relationship. And also, with that kind of relationship, you also have incredible joy when you have successes. So I think relationship is one of the key pieces, and respect is really the necessary building blocks for a school to move forward.
Sasha Ryan, you did a story last June about a teen court that they're running in Wayne County to deal with kids who commit minor crimes a little differently than they deal with kids who've committed more major crimes or adults. This sort of dovetails into this question of how we deal with discipline with young people, and it's not just in the schools, it's also in the courts.
Yeah, I think it requires a lot of innovation and student-centered approaches to discipline. And I think one of the, as an African-American woman in this African-American city, for many students, I think the question of whether what students need first or most, and especially students of color, is discipline, is something that's still being fleshed out in the society, that perhaps discipline is not all students need, and it needs to look different. We need to have a different culture of dealing with at-risk students, students of color, males of color. And so that the discussion is more complicated, and I think we need to have it. And it's hard to have in a district where we're also dealing with so much structural instability.
Sure.
So I have no answers.
Yeah.
You know what? I have covered schools throughout the state, and I've seen some suburban districts where kids don't get punished for the same transgressions that they get punished for in city schools. Really, some city schools are way more strict and less tolerant. But I do wonder, Alycia, how's Detroit doing as far as the whole issue of suspensions? Because we know that we have more students of color being suspended from schools, and we also know that affects schools of choice. You are essentially are stuck if you get suspended for whatever reason, because most schools of choice won't take a kid who's been suspended, even if it was for something trivial.
And this is where the cycle starts,
and
right?
that's where the cycle
starts with suspensions,
starts.
Elevates to other things, and
right.
now you've got a kid involved in the criminal justice system before perhaps they should. Go ahead, Alycia Meriweather.
This is one of the areas that we've been focusing on, is really looking at ways to reduce suspensions. It's part of our data dashboard that we developed in the last year to look at how many suspensions are happening at each of the schools in the A, B, and C category, and really challenging schools to think about what can be done as an alternative to suspension. There is nothing really accomplished by a suspension that does not lead to a total turnaround. So if you suspend a child and they're at home, so one of the worst offenses to me is a truant student who gets suspended. So the reason that you are being suspended is because you don't come to school, so we're going to suspend you so you can't come to school. That is illogical, and we need to think about ways to address these issues around suspension, to think about alternative ways to approach the discipline that's required, or what I call is behavior modification. Mm-hmm. So you can call it whatever you want to, but what we really want is a modification of behavior that gets us to the end goal of having a culture in a classroom that produces and facilitates respect in a teaching and learning environment. That's really why students get suspended, or a teacher feels that they have to suspend students, is because there's something that's blocking the ability for that classroom to function as it should, or the school as a whole. And I think that looking at alternative ways, we have some schools who have implemented in-school opportunities. So instead of suspending the child and them being at home, there's an alternate opportunity at the school that they're engaged in actual learning during the entire day instead of being at home where learning may not occur. And then also looking at ways that we can approach even the interaction when there is a violation. How do you restore that whole situation? So we've looked at implementing, and we actually have implemented restorative practices and PBIS, which is the positive behavior intervention system, where you're looking at ways of preventing violations, and then when a violation occurs, how do we restore that situation? And something I usually use when I teach a class at Wayne State on classroom management and really classroom culture and climate. And one of the examples I give is around a grocery store, and when you fill up your cart with items, they each have a cost. And the issue is when you get to the checkout and you have to pay the bill. In a classroom or a school where it's unclear what everything costs, when the bill comes, that's where the tension is. And in a situation where everyone is clear on what the cost is for everything, when the bill comes, then the bill is paid and we move on. And what I've seen over time is that when expectations are not clear, that's where you have the explosiveness, and that's where you have something that's escalating. The other piece that I'll say, I always try to encourage teachers to think about violations as a business transaction. It's literally as simple as a cart was full, the bill is due, you paid the bill, let's move on. And a lot of times people have too much emotion to be able to resolve that conflict and move on and restore that child back into the classroom culture. So a lot of thoughts there, but I think those are things we're looking at.
Yeah. Okay, next question comes from Imani Harris. And if you are a close listener of this show, you know that we had Imani on as a guest last year after she wrote a very passionate letter about conditions in her school, conditions in the district during the debate about what would happen with Detroit schools going forward. So, Imani, welcome back to
Thank
Detroit
you.
today. Absolutely.
Hi. I want to start by saying that I think today was a really good start, but I wanted to know how you plan on working with students. It's very easy to make plans for people without including them when you see what you think that you see, but how do you plan on working with students, because we haven't had local control in a while? So what would that look like, listening to students and talking to students and planning with students so that we can actually tell you what's happening versus what you see, because things aren't always what they seem to be?
Great question,
That's
Imani.
a great
Thank you.
question. I spend a lot of time in schools, and when I'm in schools, I make it a point to talk to students and walk with students. And a lot of times what's really surprising to me is that students are surprised that I'm talking to them. What I notice in schools a lot of times is adults don't engage in conversation with students. They're usually telling them what to do and not a whole lot of listening. And so when I end up walking through the hallway with students, I say, well, what is your name? What grade are you in? What do you enjoy? What frustrates you? And so I do a lot of that when I'm doing walkthroughs at schools. But I've also had some sit-downs with students at various schools, and I'll continue to do that because that's more formal, where I sit and I listen. And I welcome I've had different student groups reach out and invite me to come and listen, and I am open to that. But I actually take advantage of every opportunity I have to talk and to listen, because you're exactly right that a lot of times in the school, the student is the last person that people are listening to. And sometimes we miss what's actually going on because as adults, we're engaged at a different level, and we sometimes miss what's actually happening at the student level, whether that's in the halls or in the bathrooms or what's happening in the back of the classroom and outside and on the way to and from school. So I've made it an intentional purpose to listen, and I welcome opportunities. So if you're a student group or you want to pull some students together and invite me, I would be happy to come and sit down and just do a listening session with you.
Okay, we're
You know what? Real quickly,
Yeah, go ahead.
I've covered this school district for so long. I just remember there was a time when we had a citywide student council. Do we still do that?
We do. We do have
Those
a student.
kids were the greatest source of information.
They are an outstanding group of students, and that still is active.
Okay.
And they meet once a month. Yes.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to continue our conversation about Detroit schools with teachers, parents, students. We'll also be joined by Phil Pavlov, State Senator Phil Pavlov, chair of the Education Committee. Sasha Ryan, I want to thank you for being here with us on Detroit Today.
You're so welcome.
Absolutely. Stay with us, and stay with us on the phones, too. Give us a call if you want to join this conversation. 313-577-1019 is the number. We'll be right back on Detroit Today.
The Trump administration rolls out a new travel ban, leaving Iraq off the list. The new order says those who already have visas can still come. Anyone else from those countries will be barred temporarily. Plus, questions about the Affordable Care Act.
If you take away the individual mandate, how do you guarantee that people with pre-existing conditions who don't have insurance at work can get covered?
I'm Rachel Martin. How sick people get health insurance. Tomorrow on Morning Edition.
Weekday mornings at 5, right here on 1019 WDET.
Politicians may govern our democracy, but they don't do it in a vacuum. It depends on dialogue and debate and engagement among all citizens. That's where WDET's journalists play an essential role, exploring issues in a way that empowers you to make informed decisions. That's what you support when you give. Help reach the goal of $275,000 as quickly as possible without interrupting the next important conversation. Renew your support or give for the first time at WDET.org.
News,
music,
culture,
and community.
Every day.
Every day.
Every day.
On 1019 WDET.
Detroit's public radio station.
You're listening to Detroit Today on 1019 WDET, a special edition, live edition of WDET at night, with students, parents, teachers, and others interested in Detroit public schools, the emerging picture of local control, the reemergence of local control here in the city of Detroit. After nearly a decade of state oversight, we are taking questions from students, parents, and teachers for the decision makers. Alycia Meriweather, Superintendent, is here with us. Chastity Pratt-Dawsey, reporter with Bridge Magazine, who joins us frequently to talk about education issues, is here. And joining us now is Senator Phil Pavlov, Republican and chair of the Senate Education Committee. Phil, welcome to Detroit Today.
What a good opportunity. Thanks for the invitation.
We're glad you're here as well. And if you want to join the conversation, you have a question, want to talk about education in Detroit, give us a call. 313-577-1019 is the number to join the conversation. That's 313-577-1019. You can also go to the WDET Facebook page, put your comments there, or go to Twitter and hashtag Detroit Today. We will work your comments into the conversation. The focus tonight, we are trying to keep that focus on the parents, the teachers, the students, the people who are affected most by the decisions that policymakers are making about education here in the city of Detroit. So we want to get right back to those questions. First up is Tanisha Johnson. Yes, you made it to the mic. Very good.
Hi, Miss Meriweather was actually my college professor.
Oh,
so
there you go.
it's nice to see you. My question is, what are the major differences between DPS and DPS-CD, and what is your instructional vision for us as we move back into DPS-CD?
Okay, great. Good to see you again. The major differences between DPS and DPS-CD, DPS-CD was formed on July 1st, 2016, and created a new district with a fresh start financially. And primarily that is the big difference, is that we were allowed to start Detroit Public Schools Community District on July 1, and the debt that had been accumulated over the last several years was satisfied through legislation allocating money to cover that debt. And when we emerged as a new district, which I should point out, the amount of work that it took to make that happen in a very small amount of time, legally and legislatively and everything else that went into that, was an incredible task. When we emerged on July 1, the new district is virtually debt-free. And so the old district, the former district, Detroit Public Schools, was literally paying about $1,100 per student to cover debt. And so right off of the top of our per pupil state aid, $1,100 was going to pay debt. And so this fall was the first time in many, many years that Detroit Public Schools Community District, it was the first time ever that we existed, but it's the very first time in a long time that the district received full per pupil allocation, which made an incredible difference in terms of how we could proceed. The other things I think that are important to note is just a renewed focus because of the debt and because of the legislative issues and because of all of the other things. I was thinking about this because I was appointed a year ago, literally a year ago, 12 months ago, and I was thinking about all of the things that were going on a year ago. And we had teacher sick-outs, we had facilities issues, we had the principal indictments, we had the fact that we were about to run out of money in April, and then we were about to run out of money again in the end of the year. And those of you in here who worked for Detroit Public Schools or were watching, you remember this time. It was a time of chaos and turmoil and anxiety. And what I would say is one of the biggest difference about DPS-CD is that we are on a path right now for a sustainable, positive future. And with the debt being removed, a sense of calm really being restored in the district now doesn't mean we're where we should be. And I want to be clear about that. We have a lot of work to do, and our students deserve for us to do that work and be focused on the work of teaching and learning. And I feel like for so many years we were focused on debt. We had an emergency manager. More correctly, we had 5 emergency managers in the last 7 years, and we were under state control for 16 of the last 20. That is a lot going on in terms of a district that has nothing, all of those items have nothing to do with actually educating children. And so to me, the biggest difference between DPS, a legacy DPS, and I need to be careful because I'm a DPS graduate and I have much love for legacy DPS and the city. So when I say DPS-CD and we're moving forward, what I'm really saying is this new district has the opportunity to try to get this right. And we have a team that's very intense and intentional about doing that.
Yeah. Senator Pavlov, what do you say is the distinction between DPS and DPS-CD, which is this new effort that we have to govern the district locally?
Well, I think the superintendent made a great presentation on what's happening here today, but I would view this as a great opportunity for the parents, teachers, staff of the new district as a great opportunity. And to be invited here and see a room full of people that are concerned about education. It's not that didn't exist before. There seems to be a renewed interest. And in my office in Lansing, I've had several of the groups that are advocating for kids, parents, and education in Detroit come through and make their case. And I haven't had that in the past. It seems to have been kind of confrontational between Lansing and Detroit. And I think that this is a great opportunity not only to capture the moment, to reinvent yourself. And, too often times we get focused on the failures, and we really need to be moving off of that. Acknowledge that they're there, but let that community come in, wrap around that school building, that district, and be your partner. Because, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, the solutions that are going to improve learning for kids in Detroit aren't coming from Lansing, they're coming from Detroit. Yeah.
You know what, I got a follow-up question on that. The teacher was talking about, what's the difference between the old and the new legal entity called DPS-CD. And last year when there was all this debate about this law, I think there were a few components of the law that have not been really addressed and talked about, one of which is the new accountability system, the A through F accountability system that's going to be applied to the new district. And I was hoping that Senator Pavlov could talk about, are there parts of the law that we still are getting our arms around, like that accountability system? And even more specifically, I heard a legislator say, that law, the legislature fully expected under that law for the lowest 5% of schools in Detroit to close, and that just better happen because the law says it has to. Are there parts of the law that need to be more fully explained and understood?
Yes, there are, and I think one of the first things that showed the crack in that piece of legislation, because it's complex, it deals with a specific school district, and typically we don't legislate for one school district. We have a system of schools.
Local control.
Local control, elected boards. Regardless of how we got here, there were some issues that came up really quickly, and that was what's going to happen with these schools that have been 3 years on persistently low achieving. And so I think it became a court case. It's instantly, and then not Lieutenant Governor, but our Attorney General determined that, that says what it says, and schools need to be closed. But if you're a parent or if you're a student, and you received a letter saying that your school building is going to close, and here's a list of options that may include schools in Michigan's Thumb, where I just represent, that's a clunky rollout, and I think that the amount of confusion that was created, one of the things that we're working really hard on, when the whole conversation was about the financial viability of the district, I pivoted to the academics and the performance. We started having hearings in Lansing, in my committee, talking about what are we doing to really address the bottom 5% of schools, and do we need a new accountability system? And I can't agree with you more that we do. And I introduced a bill to repeal the accountability system that we have in place right now because it's not working. It's not working for the people in this room. It's not working for the people across the state.
And when you say repeal the new accountability system, you mean repeal the law that allows for the lowest 5% to be closed?
Yeah, and come up with a single accountability. So Detroit and Benton Harbor, or not Benton Harbor, but Muskegon Heights, have their own accountability system on top of a layer of 3 or 4 other accountability systems that, I've always used the analogy, if you have 2 quarterbacks, it means you don't have one. And when we confuse more and more accountability systems, we're asking districts and superintendents and building leaders to do so much more that doesn't have anything to do with instruction. And so I've been working to get a one statewide simple accountability system established that every district knows the rules, every district understands the parameters. And, over the next couple of weeks, we'll hear that, there'll be some walking back of the school closures. Yeah. But it didn't do any good to the parents that were literally concerned when they picked up that letter.
Probably frightened, some of them.
Frightened. And the one thing that I did recognize more from, when I had the parent network come through and the 482 Forward group, very advocating very strongly for their school buildings. There's a certain amount of pride that are in these buildings. And let's wrap the services around that and start that improvement plan and let it come from the places closest to that school.
Yeah. Before we move to the next question, I should note that the last question came from Tanisha Johnson. We're now talking with teachers and parents. She is a teacher at Denby High School. So, Tanisha, thank you very much for that question. Next up is Kimberly Rice Cofield. She is also a teacher at Osborne High School here in the city of Detroit. Go ahead, Kimberly.
I just want to say that I think that you are hitting the nail right on the head. I am working over at Osborne Evergreen since the school year, and this is in 48205, one of that 5% schools that's at the lowest achieving level, where we are in dire need and distress. When those students got those letters that you're talking about right now, they came to school the next day and they were in panic. They're like, what am I going to do now? This is the only neighborhood that's in walking distance to my house. These are children without transportation. They are in poverty, some of them, and they are struggling. And I am like a teacher that is really here advocating for the students. I didn't really have a question, but I just brought their question to you, which is, where do I go? Where are we going to go if you close my school? What am I going to do? What about me? Even if you give us that list of different schools that we can go to, my advice would be to keep these schools open, not to close the doors, but to open more doorways of opportunity. I'm working with Wayne State's math program over at Osborne. So I'll say bring in more colleges, bring in more opportunities such as the NSO Neighborhood Service Organization, extracurricular activities, arts programs, and things after school. They are going to do their best that they can, but we have to meet them halfway. Yeah. Don't give up on the students. I'm fighting for them.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question and those statements. Obviously, you can feel and hear the passion in her voice about this. Chastity Pratt-Dawsey, you recently wrote a story in Bridge about the fact that in other states that are doing a lot better than Michigan is, in terms of educational outcomes, there is not a discussion about closing schools. We don't do that in successful states. Why are we doing it here?
Right. I mean, let's just be real. Across the United States, urban schools are struggling with figuring out how to get all schools, to scale up excellence that they might see in a few schools and to make all their schools better. But in states that are doing better than Michigan, when they look at their lowest achieving schools, the answer is not let's close them. The attitude is let's figure out ways to reform them. Of course, the Gold Star State, Massachusetts, they told me flatly, we don't have a mechanism for closing these schools. It's a local control issue. We do have a very prescribed and detailed reform plan, and that bubbled up 20 years ago from their business and legislative bodies working together with parents to do that. We are 25, 26 years behind them, hoping that, that sort of reform effort will happen in Michigan.
Yeah. Phil, Pavlov, why do we talk about closing schools? Is that a solution?
I will be the last person to defend poor performance, but to me, the closure just represents a lack of imagination. I mean, the problems, it hasn't worked anywhere in this country. I mean, I can make an example in New York where closure has been, based on academics, closure has been attempted, but it's been attempted only after hundreds and maybe thousands of parents and community leaders have come together and created a path forward, and you don't do that in 35 days. You don't do it in 180 days. And so when we talk about academically failing schools, just to say that they're closed doesn't solve any of the problems. In fact, it creates more. And when parents in Pontiac got a letter suggesting that KPAC, and raise your hand if you know where KPAC is, I don't think you can get from Pontiac to KPAC. But I also heard, and that's up in my district, up in the Thumb, but I also heard from parents who just from the bottom of their heart said 2 miles to another school is a huge barrier. And so sometimes because our commutes in the Thumb go a little bit further than 2 miles, we lose sight of the fact that we have a very diverse education system, and that kind of barrier is a barrier to success, and it's a barrier to the quality that they need. Yeah. But closure just to close, I don't know how that. I mean, we've had to close schools in the Thumb, but that's been based on population.
Sure.
It's been based, almost all of the districts across the state are experiencing decline in enrollment. So, I mean, we have to make tough decisions at the school board level, and it's usually elementary schools, and nobody wants their elementary school that they went to in their community to ever be closed. Yeah. But realignment's necessary.
This is Detroit Today on 101.9 WDET. I'm Stephen Henderson. You are listening to a special edition of Detroit Today with a live audience in the studio here at WDET. We are talking about education here in the city of Detroit, and we're talking about it with the people who are affected the most: students, parents, teachers. We also have the superintendent of the Detroit schools here, Alycia Meriweather. Also joining us is Chastity Pratt-Dawsey. She's a reporter at Bridge Magazine, and Phil Pavlov, Republican senator and chair of the Senate Education Committee. If you want to join the conversation, give us a call. 313-577-1019 is the number. That's 313-577-1019. I should also mention before we go to the next question that we invited representatives of the State Reform Office who oversee this school closure process here in Michigan to be on the program, and they declined, so they are not here to explain what they might do or why. Let's get to our next question. Andre Floyd, you are up next. And Andre is a teacher here in DPS-CD.
Sorry, I had to come from all the way
back.
The students brought up some great issues about equity, about stopping the school-to-prison pipeline. We also just heard from the senator great ideas about improving education. I truly believe the best way to improve education for students is having excellent teachers in every classroom. How can we make it more desirable to have teachers that are excellent in each and every one of our classrooms? And how can we retain the excellent teachers we currently have?
Pay them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Chastity Pratt-Dawsey with a very simple answer right there. But the truth is, when you're talking about urban school districts like the city of Detroit, one of the biggest struggles they have is attracting the highest trained and best teachers, and then keeping those teachers, even if they come here, becomes a challenge as well.
It's easy. Research will show you that the schools that pay the least get the least experienced teachers, and Detroit Public Schools has had cut after cut after cut. There was that year where the teachers loaned the school district $10,000, and those types of pay differences make a difference. Literally the least paid school districts have the least experienced teachers. So, and that's, when I say pay them, that's not an opinion. That's just a matter of fact. That's what you see when you examine teacher ranks across the nation.
Phil Pavlov, this is also a challenge across the state of Michigan. Teacher pay, teacher retention.
Right.
It's not just Detroit. I mean, if you look at districts in impoverished communities throughout the state, they all struggle with this.
Yeah, they do. And there's issues. And I know before I came onto this segment, they were talking about this conversation about Proposal A. But here's really what's happened in school financing across the state. Every student has a value, and that foundation allowance goes to the school. When you have less students reporting into your school building, into your district, that's less revenue. It's just such a direct correlation. I think that until we stabilize our population, and we seem to be doing better there, you have an issue about how we fund. But I also think that there's an underlying debt issue, and I think that a part of the conversation, if we're going to be honest about it, is part of the debt that DPS, the old system, saw was based on legacy costs. And they're not just in DPS; they are in every school district across the state. So I've been on the forefront of trying to develop a new, innovative retirement system that protects every teacher who's in a defined benefit system today, but takes new teachers and moves them into a more modernized retirement system. The truth is about $750 per student is taken just off the top of the foundation to pay the debt accrued in the liability system. So I think that there's some serious structural issues, but imagine if we could put that money back into the classroom, and you would see significant improvement. I think one of the other things that we have to remember, too, is that when letters go out in school buildings identifying them as a failure and a foreclosure, the very best teachers are out that door. And if there's an opportunity to find a district with a little bit better compensation package, they're going to go. And then that creates the spiral around the bottom of the drain. You lose principals, you lose building leaders, you lose the best teachers, and you further exacerbated a problem that is an unintended consequence when you talk about closure.
I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things that we've really been thinking about is we have to figure out a way to make sure that the teachers that are most qualified have the most incentive to come to our most needed areas. And it is about compensation. And I would say even when you look at compensation comparing between two cities, so even if we look at the Tri-County area and you can move DPS-CD salaries to be competitive, I would argue that the conditions in which our teachers are working and the challenges that we face because of the inequities that exist in the city, the gaps in the differentiated instruction that's required in a classroom of 35 or 37 or 42, there is no comparison. Even if you made the salaries the exact same, the work is very different. And we have to figure out a way to give incentives or some kind of bonus or stipend or additional wraparound support to our teachers. I mean, you brought up a couple of very good points. The teachers and administrators in Detroit Public Schools took multiple cuts over multiple years. And the teachers took 10%, and then loaned the district, like you said, $10,000 about. Who does that? Who does that are incredibly dedicated, committed people who have chosen to stay with this district over time, and we really have to figure out a way.
We got to figure out a way to
some of it's money,
them, right?
And some of it's not related to money. I think we need to figure that out.
Okay, we need to take another quick break. When we come back, we're going to continue talking with students, parents, and teachers about the future of education here in Detroit. Stay with us and stay with us on the phones. 313-577-1019. We will get to some of your calls next. We'll be right back on Detroit Today.
Drive home every afternoon with news, features, and interviews from Detroit and around the globe on WDET.
Paul Mitchell, a Republican from Michigan. Mitchell even got his first bill passed. Well, congratulations on passing your first bill.
That's great. I appreciate that. Of course,
it's kind of a big deal.
A bigger deal when it gets to the Senate. Then I may actually sit down and have a beer or a glass of wine.
Join me, Jerome Vaughn, on All Things Considered, weekday afternoons at 4 here on 101.9 WDET.
Last spring, you asked us to reduce fundraising that interrupts your listening, and you changed everything. So now this message right here is WDET's spring fundraiser. Keep your shows coming, renew your support, or become a new member now at WDET.org.
You're listening to Detroit Today on 101.9 WDET. I'm Stephen Henderson, and as always, thanks for joining us. You're listening to a special edition of Detroit Today, a live broadcast from our WDET studios with parents, students, and teachers from the Detroit Public Schools Community District here in the studio with us. They are asking questions of some of the decision makers about what the future of education looks like in our city. With me is Alycia Meriweather. She is the Detroit School Superintendent. Chastity Pratt-Dawsey is a reporter with Bridge Magazine who joins us frequently to talk about education issues. And State Senator Phil Pavlov is here. He's a Republican and the chair of the Education Committee. If you want to join us on the phones, 313-577-1019 is the number to join the conversation. That's 313-577-1019. Our next question comes from Marcus Jones, who is a Detroit Training Center employee. Marcus, are you here? All right.
Good afternoon.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
All right, so I'm very curious to see how are we going to integrate skill traits into the curriculum for our students and really start to educate them about the various career opportunities that exist as an alternative to your traditional 4-year or 2-year institution.
Yeah. Go ahead, Alycia Meriweather.
Such a great question. Detroit Public Schools Community District does still maintain our career technical centers, so we do have 4 of those, and we just signed an agreement with the City of Detroit and major businesses to reinvest in Randolph Career Technical Center and bring that back up to the world-class facility that it should be. The other thing I'd like to highlight is we are transitioning our high schools, all comprehensive high schools in DPSCD, to career clusters. And so if you're familiar with career clusters, that means there's a focus around careers, and everything that you're doing in that educational context is preparing you for the career that is the focus for that school. And so we're looking at career clusters focus at each of the comprehensive high schools. And so obviously every high school can't address all of the career clusters. And so that means we also have to look at ways to make sure that students who are not geographically close to the high school that has their career cluster, how do we make sure that they have equitable access? So exploring transportation loops and other possibilities. But we are shifting our comprehensive high schools to career cluster focus, and that's with work with United Way and Linked Learning. And so looking at this fall, you're going to see that evident in all of our schools, but our career tech centers will remain open as a specific half-day experience.
Yeah. Let's go to Gene on the phones. Gene, welcome to Detroit Today.
Good evening, Stephen. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Gene.
2 quick questions. I'd like to know what role does the Financial Review Commission play in the governance and oversight of the school board, and how much money comes from the state school aid fund to support subsidized economic development projects inside the tax increment finance area of the city.
Gene, great questions. Some for the audience here. They cannot hear Gene on the phone. He wants to know about the Financial Review Board that's in place over the schools, and also how much money goes to economic development through the TIF district that's been created here in the city of Detroit. Who wants to take that?
I can take the FRC
question. We've got about 3 minutes left, so we need to have.
Okay, so FRC is the same commission that oversees the city after the bankruptcy, and all financial items must go to the FRC for the district. So they go to the board, but then they also have to go to the FRC, and so that is another layer of control that still exists. Although we've shifted to a locally elected board, that's another measure of control that's still in place.
Yeah. What about this school aid fund sort of loaning, I guess is what you might call it, to the TIF district, Senator Pavlov?
You know, you got me. Gene, that was a great question. I have no idea. But if you call my office at 517-373-7708, we'll put somebody on.
One of my understanding is that it is some form of loaning that goes on, and it doesn't take away from schools overall. But yeah.
Well,
Gene,
I mean,
give
I
a
think
call
that
and, we'll figure that out for
the
you.
recovery offered all kinds of options.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go. We have one more caller here. We've got a little time. Caller in Detroit. Welcome to Detroit Today. Are you there?
Hello?
No? Yes. Go ahead.
Hey, excellent. Hey, shout out to the squad. Hey, I just wanted to ask a couple questions. One in particular was that, or I just wanted to acknowledge that I actually went to a public school and then went to a charter school, and I seen how the state was trying to make it seem as though public schools were obsolete, but the curriculums that were taught in the charter schools were even worse. They weren't standard. I traveled out of state. I just actually worked at a school out of state in Montana, and I was seeing how when it comes to schools that hold students of color, the curriculums don't be nowhere near up to par with schools like in Wisconsin or Plymouth, Wisconsin.
Yeah,
you know what I'm saying?
we're a little short on time, but I appreciate that question. What about this question of charter versus regular schools? Phil Pavlov, I'll let you answer that.
Yeah, well, we require our charters to do everything in school code that the traditionals require. And I think when you talk about curriculum, curriculum is a board-level decision. So your school boards have probably the most input into what your curriculum looks like. But, charter schools offer different opportunities for parents that are maybe a departure from the traditionals. But I think in the mix of things, some parents see value in it. If they didn't, they wouldn't be there. But it's very difficult to, square one against the other just based on that quick question. But
we wish we had some more folks here in the audience who could talk about charter schools. Go ahead, Alycia.
No, we're short on time, but I push back a little bit on the statement that the same requirements are in place for charter schools as for the traditional public schools in terms of teaching certificates, in terms of curriculum, in terms of outcomes, and in terms of accountability. I really think there's some things to push back on.
One of the big arguments we're having in Michigan.
I think the issue, though, is not as much curriculum, but the standards, whether the standards are the same. And I got a real quick question. I know we're running out of time, but I would like for the audience to just by a clap. Are we doing better than we were a year ago when we had a different entity? Clap your hand if you think we're doing better.
All right. That's about 3/4 of the audience.
Clap your hand if you think Detroit schools are doing worse than a year ago before they were legally reorganized. So that tells you right there. Yeah. We got stuff
Maybe
to deal with.
Maybe half, 3/4.
We got stuff to deal with.
All right. Yes. All right. That's going to do it for us. Thank you to the panelists, Chastity Pratt-Dawsey, Phil Pavlov, and Alycia Meriweather. This education special was produced thanks to Joan Isabella, Candace Fortman, Sandra Swoboda, Olu Adelabi, Annie Scaramazino, Laura Weber-Davis, Jake Neer, Matthew Trevethan, Addie Wallace. Thanks again to Chastity Pratt-Dawsey and Sasha Ryan. This is 101.9 WDET, Detroit's public radio station. We'll see you tomorrow.
Spend your mornings with WDET and get news, local features, traffic and weather updates on Morning Edition.
We are enhancing the median shoulder to almost be a third lane as needed during key times such as morning and afternoon rush hour, and incidents where we can then open up that shoulder, use it as a lane to help manage congestion, improve safety along the corridor at those peak times.
Join me, Pat Batchelor, on Morning Edition, weekday mornings at 5 on 101.9 WDET.
Detroit in the 1960s was alive.
My name is Paul Mitchell. I'm from Michigan's 10th Congressional District. Now the Congress was in that district.
Jennifer Granholm led the state from 2003 to 2011.
Democrats and Republicans are.
Your gift allows us to bring you the news and information that you demand. Whether it's news from around the world or across the street, WDET is your trusted source for facts. Join Team DET now at WDET.org.
This is Indivisible, public radio's national conversation about America in a time of change.
From WNYC Radio, I'm Jamie Floyd, sitting in for Kai Wright. Thank you so much for joining us.
And I'm John Prideaux here from The Economist. On Mondays, we're talking with you about the first 100 days of the Trump administration, what it means for the rest of the world, how the country seems to outsiders right now. Tonight's topic is Russia and the United States Department of Justice.
And we actually want to talk about the intersection of those two major topics. And believe it or not, they do intersect. We'll get to that in a minute. But first, let's take a step back. The first real fallout for the Trump administration for talking to the Russians came when it was revealed when that National Security Advisor Mike Flynn had talked to the Russian ambassador during the transition, but had apparently lied about that fact to the vice president. Here's White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer.
Whether or not he actually misled the vice president was the issue. And that was ultimately what led to the president asking for and accepting the resignation of General Flynn. That's it, pure and simple. It was a matter of trust.
Then it was revealed that Jeff Sessions, now our new Attorney General, also met with that same Russian ambassador twice. His name is Sergei Kislyak, even though Sessions had testified under oath during his confirmation hearings that he had not. And that led to a chorus of calls on Capitol Hill for Sessions to resign as well. Here's New York Congressman Sean Maloney.
This guy had multiple meetings with the Russian ambassador, and he lied about it. And he's the Attorney General of the United States. That's not okay. And it was exactly the reason Michael Flynn resigned. I don't know why it would be any different here.
But instead of resignation, Jeff Sessions recused himself from any investigation between the Trump campaign and Russia and offered his regrets.
In retrospect, if I should have slowed down and said, but I did meet one Russian official a couple of times, that would be the ambassador.
Now, we still don't know whether or how the Russia connection will be investigated, but what we do...
You have a role.
I think your question is really about policy, which is the board is in place to set policy. And so what I will do is take that question back to the board and that it was raised in this public forum, because that's really for them to answer. I do know that one of the ways you can be involved is by attending every board meeting, for sure. And the next one is next Tuesday, 5:30 p.m. at King High School. So that's definitely a way to be involved, and I will raise that up.
I was also told that there, at the Charles H. Wright, there is a forum on Saturday for families of BPSCB students who want to know what they can do. Now Saturday, May. That's in May. May. I thought someone. She meant March. She meant March. It's something for Freedom Schools. It's for Freedom Schools. Okay. Yeah. This was someone who was here this weekend. It's a forum regular. So, but I really appreciate you all coming in. We have all your context now because we got in touch with you and your questions. So we will keep them. We'll be doing more and more things on education as the year goes on. I really appreciate you all coming and getting warm. A little bit warm. I know. I read the invite. Thank you. I'm sorry we didn't get your question.
I just want to know how you do it. That's all.
I don't know. Making some companies like a crazy foray into this world. And okay.
Nice to see you.
See the W and the D.